Right, so we're good to go. It's all being recorded now, so we're good to go. Right, so this week, the final week, it's South Sudan. What a challenge this is. So it's going to be, this is an interesting one. Um, I can't say I've left the best till last, but we still need to tackle the issues. This is Africa. This is our home. This is what we've got to tackle all countries. And this is a real contrast to some of the others. Remember, it's the newest country in Africa. So lots of challenges. So you'll see quite a contrast between South Sudan and Botswana. But anyway, let's go into it and let's see where we go. And I hope you enjoy this week. So as you know, I always cover these things every week. This is what we cover. We have reflections on good leadership, post-independent nation building. And we try to focus on how the leaders have developed peace and prosperity for their country. We do an analysis of political and macroeconomic performance. We look at moral and development ideologies. We look at national policies as best as we can. And also, of course, what we're looking at is how to encourage future leaders. This is what we've two areas we broadly use to look at leadership in Africa. There's the Ibrahim Prize for African Leadership, and it talks about strengthening democracy and human rights. It talks about sustainable and equitable prosperity. It talks about exceptional role models on the continent. And the prize, remember, I always say this, it only goes to ex-presidents and ex-leaders, not current leaders. So, and it's not given every year. So there's a lot of disappointment when it comes to Africa. So I've added some things on here, which is slightly other perspectives, which is honesty around issues of corruption, whether they've delivered clear social progress, and including specifically what's the situation with women. I think it's a major thing. If you don't talk about women, we can't talk about how high a nation has risen if we don't talk about the role of women in the society. Is there a strong economy? Is there strong and good institutions? Is there any Pan-African policy direction? Plans for succession? So these are the kind of things we try and cover as well. A bit more difficult with South Sudan because it's such a new country, so it's a little bit tricky, but nevertheless, we're going to tackle as much as we can. Oh, sorry, I don't think I've updated this actually, but anyway, sorry about that. But we've gone through all of these and we're on the last one, South Sudan. Sorry, I forgot to make it red. But we're on South Sudan. Week 7, the final week. So we've covered all these different areas. We saw Azania, South Africa, a unique struggle against apartheid, 5 million whites living in the country and land, the whole issue of land reform or the lack of land reform. We saw Ghana, the oldest democracy out of all of these, and what progress Ghana has made, and a big population. We saw Zimbabwe, a smaller population, big land size, and the whole issue of the land and the sanctions and the impact. We saw Rwanda. It's one of the role models in Africa that I consider a role model in leadership in Africa, and how much they've achieved in a short time, particularly on things like women, infrastructure development, economic growth, things like that. Ethiopia, we saw as an emerging superpower nation on the continent with 100 million people. We saw the growth there and the great potential of Ethiopia, but unfortunately still high levels of poverty and inequality. Botswana, we saw as a model of democracy in Africa, smooth elections all the way through since independence, with a relatively strong economy, still very dependent on diamonds though, or the income from diamonds. And we saw a very small population with a big landmass. So we saw a massive contrast between Ethiopia with over 100 million and Botswana with only 2 million, with virtually the same size of country. So a massive difference, like 100 million more people in Ethiopia. So it's like, it's just hard to contrast them, but we tried our best to try and do a contrast. And then we've got South Sudan, which is a very different history to the others, but obviously there's some similarities, but very different. So I just mentioned this because I just want to show that Africa has been making progress in some key areas around primary school enrollment, improvement in primary education, gender equality is one of the areas that we've done well in. If you compare us to places like India and the Middle East, where there's still major issues with gender equality. Unfortunately, in South Sudan, which we're talking about tonight, there's some real struggles around gender equality, which I'll come to in due course. Real difficulties. And we've seen generally a reduction of under 5 mortality, and we move much faster than most parts of the world. So it'd be interesting when I show you about South Sudan, what do you think about that? And also there's been a huge increase in the number of insecticide treated mosquito nets to try and prevent malaria. So those are just some good examples. So right, let's just move on quickly and we'll get on to South Sudan. Let's look at this country. So South Sudan, yes, officially is a republic. Like most independent nations immediately say they're republic because they don't have a head of state that's a monarchy. And the northern, we could describe it as a northern East Africa, because if you look at this map, I hope you can see the cursor here. Right on the Red Sea is the eastern coast of Sudan. But now southern Sudan is only this gray area at the bottom. So southern Sudan is a landlocked country, technically is a landlocked country, because with it being independent, it's now landlocked. As Sudan was not landlocked, it had the Red Sea, which is a major shipping area and major shipping lanes and access to the rest of the world through waters, of course. So that's something I'll come back to later on a bit more. Okay, so you see where Sudan is on this map of Africa on the top right. As you see, it's almost Central Africa, but it still would describe it as sort of northeastern Africa. Okay, and there's the independent flag on the bottom right. Okay, 13 million people. Some research I did said about 11 million, some said more like 13 million, and very fast growth in population. So that's another issue I'll come back to later. We talked a bit about population last week, and you know my views on population. I think population growth in poor countries is a massive issue. And when it comes to leadership and governance, if you're not doing something to deal with the massive increase in population, and you're not increasing education, healthcare, housing, and everything else, you're heading for massive poverty problems. Huge problems with poverty if the population is growing at a huge rate and you haven't grown the economic to go with it. You're heading for trouble. And I'll show you some examples of how this is impacting in South Sudan a bit later. It really is a big issue. There just needs to be a strategy of what you do about the growth in population. So the name Sudan is quite interesting. It derives from the Arabic, and it's called the land of black people. It's very interesting. That's where the name Sudan comes from. If you look at it from the Arabic, it's called the land of the black people. And if you know Sudanese people, they are definitely the land of black people. Some of the darkest people in the world. Beautiful, beautiful skin. Early history, the kingdom of Kush, which is where most of Sudan was or is, located along the Nile region in what is now northern Sudan. Intertwined with the history of ancient Egypt, which we'll come back to, the northern and Red Sea coast, dominated by Islamic incursion and influence. The south was dominated by Christian influence. This is the heart, to some extent, of the long historical struggle between North and South. But it's not just about religion. We always have to be very careful. When we talk about Africa, we talk about any conflict around the world that people claim is religious. It's never as simple as that. And if we look at Northern Ireland versus Southern, so Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland conflict against the British, or the Irish conflict against the British, is called a Catholic and Protestant struggle. It's not true. It was so we can look at that as an example. We can look at the struggle for the Palestinians against Israel, and people describe it as a struggle between Islamic people or Muslims and Jews, which is also not true. So it's very important that when we look at these issues, we look at the question of politics and power. It's not a question of just simple to say, oh, it's just a religious conflict. No, it's not. Because even in places like Palestine, there was a long history of Jews and Islamic people living together in harmony. So what created that conflict? Was it the religion, or was it some other political situation? And in South and so-called North Sudan, because remember, there's no such country called North Sudan. It's Sudan and then became South Sudan, but they didn't name Sudan North. It's just Sudan and South Sudan. That's just the way it's turned out. So it does create confusion when these things happen, because you have a country called South Sudan, you just assume there's a North. Just like Korea, there's the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and South Korea. There's no such country called North Korea, but politically, they call it North Korea all the time, but there's no such country called North Korea. So these are really important political issues, because what even names and how names come about are significant. So for example, in so-called North Korea, the Korean people took up arms to liberate their country from the occupation of Japan with the support of the Americans. And halfway across the country, they were stopped by basically by the Americans. And then the Americans basically called the South when there was no agreement. There was no real formal agreement. There was just kind of a peace, an agreement to have peace. And basically America has sort of supported the South to create its own country. And that's how South Korea came about. It had nothing to do with two countries of independence or anything like that. It's basically a neo-colony of the United States. In the same way, Taiwan is a rebel country supported by the United States, where the Chinese, Chiang Kai-shek, left China after they were defeated, ran off to Taiwan. America gave them cover, and then Taiwan is now a territory on its own, but it's still really China. So these historical conflicts, it's very important that we understand these histories, so we don't just look at things that are just simply Christians versus Islam or whatever. It's just not quite that simple. Anyway, let's keep going. Independence was issued by the UK in February 1922. So again, one of these countries that very early on received independence from the British. And with its history, it seems strange, because when you look at Sudan, you think, well, how would they come from British when it's predominantly Arabic-speaking country? But again, we'll come back to this. It was granted nominal independence with the incursion of 4 reserved areas. And what we mean by that is there's 4 areas of politics that was reserved. So basically the British, with the support of Egypt, so basically Egypt and Britain basically agreed to do a deal where they would still control foreign relations, communications, the military, and basically that whole Anglo-Egyptian situation. So it wasn't really independence. It was independence by another name. So that's not really independence. So the colonization of Sudan was mainly an ongoing fight between the British and the people of Egypt, right? Because the struggle in the end came out peaceably, in terms of not actually going to full war, or a long protracted war, when they agreed to become partners, but they didn't actually name their partnership a shared territory or colony, you know. So it's kind of a bit complicated. But anyway, that's how you have to understand that history, that they basically partnered together. Now, I want to just do a quick bit of, I'm playing around with dates a little bit here, so stay with me a bit. And I'm playing around with it because I wasn't sure how to do this. I couldn't do it completely chronologically in date order. So I'm going to jump about a bit, because we can't talk about Southern Sudan if we don't talk about Sudan and the conflict, the civil war between the North and the South. Okay, so the whole context of the President Omar al-Bashir government, that 30-year government, is very significant in the history of this conflict, because the conflict, as you'll see, well, let me just go into it. The 7th president of Sudan was basically Bashir, okay, from 89 to 2019, roughly. Okay, so it's basically over those 30 years of government, okay, when he was deposed in a coup d'etat. Okay, so he was chucked out by the coup d'etat, but how did he get to power? But after he was chucked out of power, he was incarcerated, tried and convicted on multiple corruption charges, as well as, you know, the monstrosities that he did against the people, particularly of the South, which we'll come back to in a second. So let's look at that. How did he come to power? So in 1989, when he was a brigadier general, so of course he's senior in the Sudanese army, he led a group of officers in a military coup that ousted. Now, look at this. This is why I put color on it. It was a coup against a democratically elected government of a prime minister. So he overthrew a democratically elected government after it began negotiations with the so-called rebels in the South. So you see the whole history here. So whilst the prime minister of Sudan was going to negotiate with the rebels in the South, there was always this tension between an Islamic influenced North, an Arab Islamic influenced North, dominated North, with the South that was predominantly more Christian and traditional. Even though the people in the North are still Africans, but predominantly identify themselves as Arabic and not necessarily as Africans, because predominantly they've been colonized and dominated by Arab Islamic people or influence. So there's the contradiction where a lot of people kept talking about the North Sudan suppressing the Southern Sudan as if we're two different ethnic groups. When you see the people, they actually look African, they look the same. And it's like Saudi Arabia. You ever see Saudi Arabia football team? Look at, next time you see it or Google it, look at the Saudi Arabian football team, all dark Africans. So these things create a lot of confusion in our minds as to who is who. And because of history, we come blurred and get confused. And those, what we would call Africans that live in Saudi Arabia, do they call themselves Africans? I remember who I described as a sister back in the 1980s. And I said, you're African. Well, I was arrogant and young at the time. And I said, she's African. She said, no, I'm Palestinian. And I said, no, you're African. She said, no, I'm Palestinian. She was very clear she was Palestinian, but she looked African to me. So this is where it creates these kind of contradictions, because what people are biologically is not totally what people call themselves. People will describe themselves what is politically what people describe themselves. Just like we'll have coconuts in Britain and we'll have confused people in Britain. I'm not saying that woman in Palestine was a coconut, by the way, because she was very conscious, very political, very, very sharp. I called her a sister. I always still call her a sister, but she said she's Palestinian. She was very proud Palestinian. But in that context, just like going to Cuba, when I was in Cuba back in 1997, every African I met said, I'm Cuban. They didn't say they're African. They said they're Cuban. Of course they're African, but they said they're Cuban because they saw themselves Cuban first. So history and political context is so important, that how people describe themselves is more to do with politics than it is to do with anything else. Ah, somebody's raised their hand. Who's that? Patricia has raised her hand. You might want to just put it in the chat. It's easier if you just put something in the chat. Do you want to put a question up, please? And I'll pick it up from the chat. It's probably easier for me. Let's pick it up from the chat. Let's have a look. I think we have to be careful here because there are also African Muslim groups in the Sudan, also who are considered non-Arab, such as those in Darfur, 6 times the size of France, and Nuba region. Well, that's exactly what I've been saying. I mean, we might have not said it in the same words, but basically what I'm saying is, yes, the people who describe themselves as Arabic and Islam as Africans, as you said in Darfur, the whole history of that whole contradiction of the what was described as a massacre and a human rights violation, and the whole thing, you know, is it the whole argument around the whole situation in Darfur? There's a long, long history. And of course, this is exactly the point I'm making. So thanks for that. Is that Haroon? But I agree with you. This is exactly the point I'm saying. Now, a lot of African Muslims in the North. And that's what creates the contradiction, because if the people in the North describe themselves as Arabs and see themselves as Islamic Arabs, it's easy for us to say it's an Arabic versus African conflict, when a lot of the people in the North are actually Africans who supported Bashir and supported the Bashir government. Even if you look at Bashir himself, look at his name. His name is very Islamic. But if you actually look at him as a person, look at a picture. I didn't put a picture of him up. But if you look at President Omar al-Bashir, very, very Islamic name. But if you look at him, he looks African. So this is where, as I said, it creates a lot of confusion. So I agree with you. All right. So let's keep going. Another part of history, the Civil War. Now, the reason why I'm raising this is because we looked at this, and basically there's been a long civil war that is predominantly been between Bashir's government and the Sudanese Liberation Army. Yeah. Let's just move on a second. Let me just bring that up. So civil war raged between the North and the South for more than 19 years. Effectively, it developed between a struggle for the SPLA, because I used to know them as the SPLA. You know, back in the day, we had links, and I spoke to people in the Sudanese People Liberation Organization. I think it was SPLO. I'm trying to remember the name of the organization that supported the armed struggle, but I can't remember. It's such a long time ago now, back in the 80s and so on. But anyway, the SPLA is the Sudanese People Liberation Army, basically fought a war that they saw as a battle between them and Bashir's government, because Bashir was in power for 30 years. So effectively, most of that that 20-year war there was only one person in power. So that's why it became seen as one. I've got another point. I'm just going to pick that up now. Another question that was raised. We have nationality, biological ancestry, ethnicity, and culture. And some people don't know to distinguish one from the other. Yes, absolutely. And even if we say people don't know how to distinguish, it's a problem we all have. So even though you might want to criticize people for what they describe themselves as, it's not even that simple, because people have different levels of consciousness, people have different political realities, and it's not easy to just, if you just walk into Cuba and say, why don't you call yourself Africans? But they have a very particular struggle around their revolution and nationalism around being Cuban. And you can't blame them for calling themselves Cuban, but that doesn't mean they don't see themselves as Black, but they just might not see themselves as African in terms of the language they use. But that doesn't mean they're confused necessarily. So we have to be careful when if we impose our own definition on others. I mean, people in my family won't call themselves African necessarily, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily confused, but they can have difference of opinion and beliefs. And yes, we can always criticize other people, but we have to be a bit sensitive to some of these issues, because as we're colonized people, there's lots of different issues going on. And as I said, it gets complicated, because what about what I described as a sister in Palestine? Who am I to tell her she's not Palestinian when she's got a huge struggle? The dominant struggle in Palestine is against Israel, not a struggle of Africans versus other non-Africans. It's a struggle of Palestinians versus Israel and the world. And it's very difficult to say to anybody in that dominated situation that, look, African is more important than being Palestinian. Well, to them, it's not. And so this is why I say politics can get very complicated. We've got some more comments here. Totally agree. Thank you. Lovely. So let's keep going. It's always nice to be interactive and be able to respond to what you say. So the war resulted in millions of people in the South being displaced and starved. So it was a genocide. You know, people, you could call it a genocide or a form of a genocide in a sense, the war. And there was a long battles about the whole thing around, as you said, Kafur, and the whole thing around, is it a genocide or is it not a genocide? If you remember so-called Colin Powell, we'll all call him Colin Powell, but anyway, he calls himself Colin Powell, used to be the African-American head of the military in the United States. When he became Secretary of State under the first Bush administration, he struggled with whether he would call it a genocide or not, because if it was described as a genocide, it would allow United Nations military, the Security Council to impose military action on Sudan, and they hid away from calling it a genocide. So it's quite interesting, but for most of the world, we saw it as a genocide against African people. But this is where, as I said, it's complicated, because a lot of the people committing the genocide were also Africans. So this is where, as I said, it gets complicated. It was easily portrayed by many as Arab people killing African people. But as I said, it's not quite that simple. And at least 2 million casualties. In other words, casualties is a soft word for saying people who died. So this is why I wanted to get this out there, because I don't think you can really talk about South Sudan at all unless you explain this history, because the whole reason there is somewhere called South Sudan is because of the struggle with the North and the constant oppression by the government in the North, and the use of oil money to prop up that government, oil money to get the arms, and how other forces around the world supported them to suppress the people in the South who said, we don't want to live under the Arab rule, we don't want to live under Islamic law, we want to live in our own way. And that wasn't allowed. So it's just a constant conflict, as I said, over 20 years, basically 20 years of conflict. But because of what was happening by the Bashir government, it basically, particularly after September 11th, because we have to understand the context here, most of the West was not condemning them until September 11th. And then after September 11th, and there was more pressure from the West on anybody who was Islamic, anybody who could support or was seen to support so-called revolutionary or so-called terrorist forces. So therefore, the American government and others put sanctions and called them state sponsors of terror. So this is where language and stuff changed. So it's really interesting to see how it changed. So international sanctions were placed on Sudan, putting more pressure on them to negotiate. So around 2005, the peace was consolidated with an official signing by both sides, what they called the Nairobi Comprehensive Peace Agreement, which is because it was signed in Kenya, and what was described as a neutral place, granting Southern Sudan autonomy for 6 years. So between 2005 and 2011, basically, Southern Sudan could govern itself, and then after 6 years, it could have a referendum to decide if it wanted to be self-governed nation. So that's exactly what happened, of course. So let's keep going. So it created a position called a co-president position, and allowed the North and the South to split oil deposits equally, 50-50, but also left both the North and South's armies in place. So the predominant Sudanese Liberation Army was left in place, with becoming the army of the South, and then the government of the North kept their army as well. But the peace, and that peace has, to a certain extent, held, and there's bigger problems in the South where there's been lots of problems. And part of it is because of what happened with John Garang, which to this day I still think was an assassination, because these coincidences are very difficult to deal with. Coincidences, right? John Garang was the big leader of the Sudanese People's Liberation Army. He's very famous for a very tall, dark brother who had the famous sort of hat, and he was very, 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 well, maybe I shouldn't say, I can't say it around the world he was respected necessarily, but he was respected as the dominant leader of the South Sudanese people. And he served as the first vice president of Sudan, or effectively, basically, he's running South Sudan. And 3 weeks later, he died in a helicopter crash. And however you look at that, it's very difficult to believe it was just an accident. If it was just an accident, it's a very unfortunate situation that has led to more problems in the South, I think, because of that problem. Because he was a developed economist by profession, and he was a major influence on the movement, as it says there. And, you know, it led to the foundation of that Southern Sudan. So the fact that he was a developmental economist could have been a major advantage for him taking power and moving the country forward from 2005. So effectively, over the last 15 years, he hasn't been the leader, and he hasn't been able to help the country develop or move in a direction. So it's really, really a sad situation. We'll never know what could have happened. All right. So let's look at this situation of the population, okay? So the Southern Sudan's population, predominantly African cultures, who tend to adhere to Christian, and this is what it states when I do the research, and I still don't fully understand what animist beliefs are supposed to be, but I would call it, I wouldn't have used that term. I'm using it because that's what I found in the research, but I found it difficult there was a brother I wanted to get hold of who's I knew from Sudan and was progressive, but I wasn't able to make contact in time to give me the research or give me some access to information, so I could have put it on these slides. But basically, somebody's put their hand up again. Just put it in the box if you want to put a question. And basically, I describe it as Christian and traditionalist African beliefs. All right, and that was at odds with the Sudan's largely. And remember, when we say Sudan, we mean the northern government, okay? A largely Muslim and Arab government. And as I said, there's question marks. What does it mean by Arab? Because as I said, many of them were Africans or are Africans. So after the Sudan region was invaded, this is going back now. So this is why I'm saying I'm jumping around a little bit to try and put a story together so you can understand. So in 1820, Muhammad Ali, of course, not the Muhammad Ali, the viceroy of Egypt under the Ottoman Empire, and the southern Sudan was plundered for slaves. So this is the constant history of antagonism between the north, supported by Arab incursions, by the Egyptians and people from the Ottoman Empire, and the contradiction between the north and the south, constant contradictions between them. And that's what's caused that long history of antagonism that is still a problem up today. So by the 19th century, Sudan was under British Egyptian rule, okay? So although the north accepted British rule relatively quickly, there was greater resistance in the south. So the south, as I said, has never accepted it. So that's where I say there's a constant conflict between what's going on there. And it led to, of course, to a bias in developing the North, because if the British and the Egyptians had support in the North, or was a sort of an agreement, and the South wasn't accepting it, then inevitably what you see is the conflict means the North gets developed. The North is where the government is. The oil was there, so it's the North that gets developed. So it exacerbates the contradiction between the South and the North. So it makes things even worse than they were before. Oh, somebody's put in, but you've put it in the Q&A bit rather than the general bit, because I don't think everybody can see that. But it says, I agree. Patricia says, I agree. Usually the term used for African spiritual beliefs and practices. Okay, thank you very much for that. So yes, going on. We'll keep going. Bit more history. So Sudan actually finally became independent in 1956. I'm not going into too much detail of that side of it, because if tonight we're talking about South Sudan, we don't want to get bogged down with spending too much time on the North and how the whole of Sudan was formed, because we're talking about this modern country that's effectively been independent for about 15 years. So if we want to do that, we need to focus on that. So time's running, we're almost an hour in already, and we haven't got into South Sudan in any major detail yet, just to kind of put in that historical context. But the context is so important. So numerous governments found it difficult to win the general acceptance from the country's diverse political constituencies, which is a code word for basically saying the South never accepted the North's rule, basically. So conflict arose between those in the northern leaders who hoped to impose a vigorous extension of Islamic law and culture to all parts of the country. See, so this pursuit of is Islamic law and culture, which is not African, but includes Africans, was consistently resisted from the South. And that was a major source of conflict, constant source of conflict. Okay. So let's keep going. Civil war, a very long initial civil war. So we talked about the 20-year war. We didn't even talk about this war yet. So it's the first civil war, you could say, until Addis Ababa Agreement. So that was in Ethiopia in 72, when Haile Selassie was still in power. Ended the conflict, but only temporarily, because again, as I said, this conflict didn't end until Sudan, Southern Sudan basically got its independence. Widespread fighting resumed again, and you had the second civil war from 83 right up to 2005, basically, when there was a ceasefire. So this is what I'm saying, why we're talking a very, very long war, well over 20-year war here, a constant war. And if you add these other years on, you're talking, you know, a very long period of resistance. So 2005 is what's commonly known as the CPA, the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, which ended the warfare and generated the outline of new measures to share power between the two, because most of the wealth of Sudan was from oil, and the oil pipeline comes through from the north to the south. So there's this kind of dependency on each other. So although the oil is in the south, the pipelines to take the oil to sea are through the north, up to the north to the sea. So if Sudan was going to agree to keep all the oil, or try to agree to keep all the oil, the problem was, how was he going to pump it to the boats, to ships to take the oil, to sell the oil? If Northern Sudan said, well, if South Sudan said, you're not getting any of the oil, well, North Sudan could simply say, well, you're not using our pipes then. So you've got a problem. How would you get it to the ships? You can only get it to the ships through Northern Sudan. So if you're not going to use the pipeline, how are you going to get it there? You're not going to put it on trucks, because it's going to take forever and it's going to be a nightmare. That's going to make it so expensive. So basically the South had to more or less agree. They were forced into agreement with the North to say, we're going to share the oil wealth 50-50. So it's just to understand that contradiction, okay? So that's when they say distribution of wealth, they mean specifically the oil wealth, and also to provide security in Sudan. So what it meant is that they wouldn't, you know, there would be safe passage and things like that to have that peace agreement. A little bit more. It also granted Southern Sudan, as you said, semi-autonomous status. That was initially at 2005. And as I said, it stipulated that you could have a referendum after 6 years. So what happened? Of course, everybody knew what was going to happen. A week-long, I remember this, a week-long vote of independence was held in January 2011. And with the results indicating the South's overwhelming preference to secede, and secede means independence. So that's what happened. South Sudan declared independence by July 2011, okay, which is the newest state in the world, okay, newest government in the world, newest country in the world, which goes with a lot of issues. So now when I go into the economics, we have to understand the situation here. This is going to be a bit of a tough message, but we need to go into this. And it's interesting, maybe we can have a discussion at the end as well. So GDP fell. So this is the first early indicator of the consequences. I'm checking my phone just to see if there's anything comes through from Nigel, just to make sure I keep in touch with him if he comes through to me. He's gonna, as I said, he's gonna try and join us. So GDP fell from 35 billion in 2011 to 19 billion in 2017. So you can see there was a heavy price to pay for independence. The economy collapsed effectively, because to lose from 35 billion to 19 billion is a huge hit. That's basically over 15 billion. And we're talking nearly half the economy here. So the economic situation in Sudan was already difficult, and this made it even worse. Per capita, I tried to work it out, but then when I got some more research from Statistica, I think it's called, I found out that it was much worse than my calculations. So the calculations I did was the GDP divided by the population. But when I actually got the factual figures that was from the stats based in 2020, I'm not going to argue with the stats from Statistica. They're one of the most well-known statistical companies around. £310 per capita in 2014. And if you didn't think that was bad enough, it fell to £275 per capita in 2019. We already said in Ethiopia that anything around that kind of mark of just a few £100 is very, very, very low and very poor. If you think of when we did Botswana, it was $18,000, nearly $19,000 per capita. So if you look at the difference in wealth between 300, so if a government has $300, it can spend on every person in the population, compared to a country that has $19,000, it can spend on per person in the population. That's the total wealth of the country. You can see there's no way you're going to have a similar economic situation. Okay, it's just chalk and cheese basically. And the other thing that was frightening was inflation. You see, when you have high inflation, you have another major problem on your hands. You see, if I give you £100 and inflation's 51%, it basically means that £100 is only worth, within a short space of time, can be worth only £50. You know, 51% inflation is taking away half your money, because if everything goes up by 50%, so what was £100 last week or last year is now £200. Sorry, is now £50 more. That's a huge extra cost you've got to find. So for every pound you spent last year, you now got to spend £1.50. Your economy is effectively going backwards and shrinking, and the people's spending power is massively going down. 51% inflation is crazy. You know, it basically means you'd have to double your income. You know, it means 51%. If you had a 51% pay increase, you'd have 50% more income to earn. It's a huge amount of money, right? So if you were earning 10,000 a year, you'd have to be earning 15,000 a year just to keep up. So you can see how that has a massive impact on people. So the economy of South Sudan is one of the most oil-dependent economies in the world. And I put plus agriculture because agriculture is a major part of Sudan, but it's not very economically strong. So it's a kind of a contradiction, which I'll come to in a second. Because oil dependency, look at that, 98% of the government's income comes from oil. That's what I mean by oil dependent. I mean, how much more dependent can you be than that? 98% of your total revenue comes from oil. So imagine what happens and what has happened in the last few years where oil prices have fallen. You see, you've got to look at the other economic forces and social and geopolitical forces in the world. What has happened in the last 10 years? Now, in the last 10 years, certain things have happened. Iran, the axis of peoples in the world who've got high levels of oil. Libya, Venezuela, Iraq, Russia. These countries have high levels of oil and economies of high level of oil. But the problem is they're nearly all hostile nations to America and the West. So the America and the West do everything they can to cripple these countries. So Libya got invaded, Iraq got invaded, Venezuela's been destabilized, Iran's been destabilized, Russia is under attack as well, but they can't attack Russia directly because they've got military arms and they're too powerful. So not economically, but politically, too powerful. You've got Putin there as head of state, and he's got nuclear weapons. So they can't go into Russia too hard. But what they can do, the other backdoor way of crippling these economies that are oil dependent, is to encourage countries who are friendly to the West, like the puppet government in Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia has one of the biggest reserves of oil in the world. So what the West have done is encourage Saudi Arabia to oversupply oil. So Saudi Arabia's got more money than sense. It's got more money than it needs. So Saudi Arabia is pumping oil like nobody's business, because Saudi Arabia can afford for oil prices to fall from $100+ a barrel to less than $50 a barrel. Now, if your 98% of your budget is based on oil, and when it was $100 a barrel, if it drops to $50 a barrel, your economy is basically crippled. It goes in half. So you can see why the economy in South Sudan has become so problematic. So when we look at anything, we have to look at this whole geopolitical map of the world to understand the forces of what's going on. While Saudi Arabia over pumping oil, you increase the supply of oil. If anybody studied economics, and if you're going to study Africa and you're going to study the future of Africa, you must study economics. Even though you predominantly, wherever you study, it will be dominated by Western economic theory, but you can use the general models of economics to have a different interpretation of the world. So I've studied economics, not to a high level, but good enough to have a basic understanding so I can interpret what's going on. And I understand the basic forces of supply and demand. The basic supply and demand forces in the world is if there's a high demand for a product or a mineral or a service, the price pushes upwards. If there's low demand, the price drops down. That's generally the price. If you look at house prices, if there's a high demand for house prices and low supply, prices rocket. What's coming up soon is there's going to be a high supply and a low demand because people are losing their jobs. There's going to be massive unemployment. There's going to be economic shock. The country's gone into recession. People are going to be scared to buy property because they're not sure that it's going to be worth the same next year. So even though they're doing the stamp duty at the moment, the British government I'm talking about, to stimulate it, we all know that house prices are almost certainly will crash sometime later this year or next year. And that's what causes problems. It's basic supply and demand. So that's how you cripple an economy that's dependent on oil. So Sudan, I don't think was a deliberate player in this, but it's as a consequence, any country like Nigeria or any countries like that that are very oil dependent is going to feel it as well. They're almost casualties of war. So look at the resources that South Sudan has at its disposal. Massive natural resources, including very fertile land, a vast livestock, 60 million cattle, sheep and goats. But they've got 60 million cattle, sheep and goats with 11 million people, but they're still going hungry. So you can see that there's some sort of problem of leadership here, some sort of problem of how are you managing this problem? How is it being distributed? How can you have 60 million cattle and sheep and goats in the country and people still finding it a bit difficult to feed themselves? Okay, so political instability, poor governance and corruption is a constant problem in this young country. South Sudan is mostly underdeveloped. It's part of its own history that it's underdeveloped, but also what has it done in the last 15 years. So if you think of Rwanda has had 25 years, or approximately, and Sudan's had 15 years now. So there's almost 10 years advantage there, isn't there? But even though there's almost 10 years advantage, or it's nearly 26 years Rwanda, 10 years advantage, it still shows how much work's to be done. Because if you look at Rwanda 10 years ago, it still did pretty well. And Rwanda's got a similar population size to Sudan. So the more could be done, potentially. So it's interesting when we compare nation for nation. So Sudan, Rwanda, similar populations, around 11, 12, 13 million, that kind of mark. Similar part of the world. In fact, Sudan's got more land and more cattle because it's flatter. Rwanda's smaller, much smaller, similar population, but much smaller land mass. and much less cattle, sheep and goats. So it just shows that in terms of the way forward, one of my conclusions from all these weeks is that without economic success, it almost doesn't matter what you do. Good governance and economic success is the foundation of everything you're going to do. And I still haven't found any country in the world that has substantially developed itself through agriculture. Don't know of any. I know countries that got strong agriculture, but I don't know of any that's got strong economy based on agriculture. None of them. If you look at Singapore, Malaysia, all of these so-called tiger economies in Asia, you know, if you look at China, if you look at South Korea, if you look at Japan, not one of them were built on the back of agriculture. If you look at Russia, wasn't built on the back of agriculture. United States wasn't built on the back of agriculture. But because of their wealth, they could subsidize their farmers, because this is what the United States has effectively done. It subsidized its farmers so food is cheap. So food is cheap in the United States because the American government has wealth and it subsidizes its farmers and it steals the land from Latin America. That's also part of it. And it invades countries to get cheap access to land and resources. But nevertheless, their food is relatively cheap, so the people live very well. And that's why there's so many overweight people in the United States. That's another story. So it's really important to develop the economy. So if you've got a political leadership and you don't have good governance and economic development, you haven't got the money to develop most of the things you want to do. And therefore your people suffer, and it's very, very difficult to get yourself out of this hole. Most of the villages in the country have no electricity, no running water. I mean, this is a massive problem. If you don't have running water, that means you're going to have disease and you're going to have lots of problems, because people don't have access to clean water to drink, don't have clean water to clean themselves, don't have clean water to, you know, it's just a big problem, massive problem. And the country's overall infrastructure is lacking, and it only has 10,000 kilometers of road. It's very, very, very underdeveloped. This is just a map. I know you can't see this perfectly well, but I just wanted to show you this because you can see this, that black line, that black double line from the port of Sudan all the way down here. It's not down, it's up. So the oil is predominantly in these regions, these colored regions and these sort of squares at the bottom here. That is where the oil comes from, or where the oil's being developed. And that's a pipeline that goes all the way past Khartoum, all the way up to the port of Sudan. So you can see why the southern Sudan, even though you can't see the line of southern Sudan here, but if you remember what the map looked like, southern Sudan is about halfway across. So how do you get the oil from this south all the way to the port of Sudan without some sort of agreement with northern Sudan? You see the problem? So you'd either have to go through Ethiopia, you either have to go through Egypt or something, but you're going to have some way round. And if you go through Egypt and the Central African Republic, that's a long way to go all the way around to there. And who's going to put the pipeline in? Who's going to pay for it, and how's that going to happen? Similarly, if you go through Ethiopia, how are you going to put the pipeline in? Who's going to pay for it? And then you've got to put a pipeline through Ethiopia, maybe also through Eritrea as well. So you can see a massive problem there. So this is a long-term problem that Southern Sudan is going to have with Northern Sudan, because any oil that gets found in Southern Sudan is going to have to pump through this pipeline, unless you can produce another pipeline that goes through, as I said, Ethiopia or Eritrea. But then you're going to have an agreement with Eritrea or Ethiopia. So you can see independence. You've got to be careful what you wish for sometimes, because you wish for something, and I'm not saying they shouldn't get independence, but you wish for something and then you find yourself in a bit of a jam because you're in a situation where you're a landlocked country and you're still dependent on the people you've just fought. So it's really, really a tricky situation. We've got a question here, so let me have a look at that. How should leaders deal with resistance towards good leadership? Excluding Ethiopia, tried to block import of used clothing to support local industry, but USA started to threaten and put pressure on the country. Yes. So it is difficult. Yes, there's always going to be these conflicts because you've got to make a decision. How are you going to stand up to the West? Now, my personal view is that you don't stand up to the West by having a, I was going to say something there, but I won't say it on video. But basically, you don't fight a bully by staring a bully down and saying you're coming for them when you haven't got, basically, you've got a water pistol. You've got water pistol and they're pointing nuclear weapons at you. It's not a fair fight. So the big West I'm saying we need to stand up to them, but you need to be a bit clever about how you do it, because you can't just confront. You're a poor country like South Sudan, 11 million people, small population, very little money, and you're going to take on the might of China and America. It's not going to work. So you need allies, you need cute leadership, you need to look at broadening the economy, look at building relationships with other nations around the world so you're not dependent on the West. You need other ways of looking at how you're going to build your economy. If you depend on oil, you're going to be in trouble, because, as I said, oil prices are very volatile and you have to depend on the North to get that oil. Now, if you develop your infrastructure, develop your economy to Ethiopia, Central African Republic, Egypt, etc., and the rest of East Africa, you've got great trade opportunities there. So you could trade in so many different things. You could trade the agriculture, you could build infrastructure, put in those economic things that we talked about in Ethiopia, where you have an economic zone. You stimulate the economy, encourage inward investment, you know, but you have to stimulate and get the education going, because people don't want to invest in a country where the people have got very little education, because it's very difficult to train people who can't read and write. And, you know, these are the difficulties you have. So these are the struggles you have with these different issues. Even, you know, bringing in the West where everybody speaks Arabic. You know, these are real tensions. You have to decide, what language do people speak? How do you train people in languages to make it more likely that people invest? So you get a lot of Arab countries might want to come and invest because there's the similar speaking. But what about Western nations? What about China? What about other countries? Although China invests anywhere, there's always a way around these things, but they're just political issues you need to consider when you're trying to integrate regions or integrate people. Because if you look at France and England, how many people in England have learned French, Spanish, etc.? But the European Union still flourished. But if you look at it another way, most of the Europe saw Britain as arrogant, and most of the other European nations have learned English, French, Spanish. So most of the European leaders and most people who live in European countries can speak multiple European languages. Britain is the exception that tends to be arrogant and doesn't speak any other languages, or very rarely, you know, not in large numbers. But predominantly, how do you integrate people if you don't, you know, language is a factor. It's not essential, but it obviously helps. It helps to make, you know, discussions and political diplomacy, etc., easier if you speak similar languages. So it's just a factor, but it's not the be all and end all, but it is a factor. So let's keep going. Let's look at some more areas. So all revenues were split equally between North and South. That was what was in the agreement. And as you can see, it goes through that Red Sea state, Northern Sudan. Sorry, I'm getting hot now. I've got to put the fan on. Let me know if you can hear it. I don't think you can hear it. It's not too loud. The agreement stated, as I said, that the government would share the oil revenues 50-50, and foreign-based oil drilling has begun in the south. So that's where this map is basically, I nicked this map to put it here, so you can see that these are some of the zones where they've encouraged foreign governments and foreign businesses to come in and start drilling oil to find other oil in southern Sudan. But as I said, how are they going to get the oil to the port? They're still going to have that same problem. And the North have said, any oil you find, and it has to go through North, we still want part of it. So it's a real tricky one. So let's have a look at this. The top part, is the overseas consortiums, right? So there's a big overseas consortium between a Chinese petroleum company, Malaysian petroleum company, and the Indian petroleum company, with a very tiny 5% by the Sudanese government. So that's the main consortium looking at oil in that region. Sudan is on America isn't playing any significant role here. Some people might say that's a good thing, because then the Americans are not getting involved, and therefore they can't create economic crisis for you if they're all Americans are involved, and then they pull out or they put sanctions on you. But the reason why American oil companies and others can't go into Sudan in any significant way is because there's still this issue of the North is seen as a sponsor of terrorism, and therefore any oil production in the South is supposed to go to feed the North. Therefore, America won't officially support American companies giving oil wealth to the North. So this is where it creates a problem for the South. If you see it as a problem, depends how you look at it. Because as I said, American companies not being involved in the South, some people might see that as a positive, not necessarily a negative. Let's look at agriculture for a bit. I'm spending quite a lot of time on economics because I think it's a massive issue and we need to look at it in some detail before we look at some of these other areas. Okay, so let's look at agriculture. So in 1999, Sudan first started exporting oil. Agricultural production in the country has declined since then. So it's actually going backwards. So according to the World Bank, the average annual growth rate of agricultural sector between 2000 and 2008 was 3.6%, which is very, very low. And if you compare that to the previous period of 10.8% growth, that's the previous decade. So growth in the previous decade was over 10% a year, which is pretty big, massive. That's over 100% growth, well over 100% growth in 10 years, to only 3% growth in over 8 years, which is very, very small. So they haven't managed to stimulate agricultural production to really, really drive up production and increase incomes for people. The UN Food and Agricultural Agency, which is called FAO, carried out an extensive satellite land cover survey that showed that 4.5% of the available land is under cultivation. Now think about this. Sudan is a huge land area. Huge. If you look at the size of Sudan as a country, it's massive. Even though South Sudan is only half, still half of a lot. If you compare it for 11 million people, if you look at Southern Sudan compared to Spain, France, England, it's much bigger. Britain's got a population of 60 million. There's only 11 million people in Sudan. So there's huge land and they're only using 4.5% of it. So 95% plus of the that they could cultivate is available but not being used. So you can see it's massively under-resourced. Now, to cultivate land of that size, if you haven't got automation, which basically means huge infrastructure, you know, you're talking about massive tractors, combine harvesters, these massive mechanized. So you need to mechanize and industrialize agriculture. Otherwise, you're never going to be able to make use of it. Just having one man or woman with a donkey and a cart and a few basic tools is not going to really cultivate that land. You're never going to make most use of it by doing it like that. So you need mechanization, but to bring in mechanization, you need money. Who's going to bring in that money when the returns on agriculture is traditionally not high? So it's not easy to invest in agriculture for a profitable return. As I told you before, most countries around the world who are wealthy haven't got high profitable agriculture. They have finished products that make a lot of money, but to bring in that, what most of these countries do is they subsidize the agriculture by the government putting money into agriculture to secure food for its people, but it's not really profitable. So they use their wealth to subsidize it. Britain, Europe is well known. The agricultural subsidies in the European Union have been well argued about. Google it and see. They always called it all the waste of the food banks, where they'd rather throw food away than sell it, because if they sell it, they make the prices go down. So you create artificial scarcity by dumping the food rather than selling it. Because if you sell it, you just bring the price down because there's too much supply. So they'd rather burn it than to actually sell it, which is crazy. Doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But that's the problem with one of the dilemmas of agriculture. It's not very profitable because a lot of the world can supply its own agriculture at low prices. So how are you going to sell it to them at a high price? That's the dilemma. See, how does Africa sell agriculture to Europe when Europe is subsidizing its own agriculture? When America is subsidizing its own agriculture, when China and other countries are subsidizing their agriculture. So how do you sell it to them profitably when these governments are putting huge money into their own sectors? You see, so this is the dilemma. This is why you need to build wealth. This is why I'm a strong believer of economic strength first, not agricultural strength first. See, if you've got money, you can buy food. You see, you could say, well, I can grow food in the garden. That's fine. What happens if the food doesn't work very well for you? What happens if you get ill? What happens if there's a flood? What happens if something goes wrong? What if food prices crash? You can say you can always feed yourself, but if you've got money, you can always feed yourself because you can buy it. So this is the dilemma. So you've got a country like Singapore that virtually produces no food, but because it's so wealthy, it can import all the food it needs. China produces very little food considering it's got 1.2 billion population, but it can import the food it needs. So this is why I don't believe that Africa's future is to say we're going to have massive agricultural production. I'm not saying we shouldn't have it. I'm saying it's not the solution to our problems. That's my argument. The solution is build an economic wealth that can pay for the agricultural development, and therefore you're not food dependent by importing food. Because the other problem with Africa now is we are also importing food, but if we're not wealthy, it's very expensive for us to import food whilst our farmers are starving to death. And there's the dilemma that we constantly find ourselves in, you know, and there's the crazy situation. How is it Nigeria produces rice and it imports most of its rice? You see, these are the kind of crazy situations we find ourselves in, because it's cheaper to bring the rice in from out abroad than it is to produce it locally. How is that possible? It's crazy, because of the way the economic systems are manipulated by Western forces and others to keep their prices down for their own benefit. You could argue, why blame them for that? It's our problem. We should sort ourselves out. But I know it is manipulation. So decline in agricultural production and a reliance on expensive foreign food supplies have contributed to severe food shortages in southern Sudan, which is kind of inevitable, isn't it? It's just what I just said. Let's look at the role of women. So I'm moving away from the economy now, even though it will touch on it. And let's look at the role of women. Let's look at education. Let's look at healthcare. And then we'll kind of start concluding, okay? So hopefully we'll have time for questions, and hopefully other people will be able to join us and ask some questions. I'm going to unmute some of you as well. And a few more have joined us, which is nice to see as well, as we're going along. Right, let's keep going. It's not a great story, by the way. The fertility rate, remember I said I'm going to come back to population, is one of the highest in the world, okay? Got a question here. Raphael says, thank you for dropping the truth, Asari. Well, the truth is the truth. You know, there's no point in me being here and trying to put sugar on things. We've got to just tell it as it is. Right, now, what does it mean fertility rates is high? Now, you're going to see the consequences of this. So, if the average woman in Sudan, this was in 2016, I don't have any reason to believe it's any lower now. Some of the predictions for the population growth by 2023 was 2.3 million more children born over the next 3 years. So that means the population's going up by nearly 20%, in 3 years. Now, if the population is growing at 20% every 3 years, that means the population is going to double in the next decade or so. I mean, this is a serious problem. So if the country stays this poor over the next 10 years and your population doubles, you're going to have even more poverty, even more problems. This is why I'm saying that it's not population control per se, but if you don't get the economy growing faster than this population, you're going to be perpetually struggling to develop your people. And this is an oppressive situation. And you'll see how all the negativity around women is predominantly around this whole issue as well. So it's not just not an emotional thing to say we don't want our women to have too many children. That's not the issue. The issue is the consequences and the context of which women are in. With women having 5 children on average per woman, let's look at the consequences of some of this whole situation of the oppression of women in southern Sudan. This is like a consequence rather than a deliberate, I'm not saying it's the deliberate strategy, but it's the consequences of a number of different political decision-making that allows our women to be in this terrible situation. So look at this. Many women do not have adequate access to healthcare resources or education in Sudan. Women have gained more power, but still face a lot of inequality. And that means more power since independence. Since 2011, 2005, the position of women has improved. And now some people, they don't, you know, we don't like to come with these issues, but the reality is in a lot of Islamic countries, the position of women is not great. So that is a historical contradiction as well that we need to mention here. So there has been progress since independence. Inequality has gained national attention, and people have become more interested in the issue of child marriage. Remember I mentioned this before. Children getting married is a major problem. And it's not children getting married, it's women getting married. Girls, sorry, getting married. Because when we say children, we mean girls. Boys don't marry young. It's older men marrying girls. And there's an exploitative situation. And if they're average having 5 children, these women are not educated, have little access to healthcare, and they're poor, and they've got 5 children. There's no way those women are going to be able to get out of that oppressive situation. It's very, very, very oppressive situation. When you put that whole scenario together, how do you get out of that situation? You're a mother and a wife when you're still a child, and your husband's an adult male, and you got all these children. You haven't gone to school. You haven't got access to healthcare. You haven't got basic resources. You're not going to have a car. You're not going to have any of these basic things to make life easier. You don't have electricity. You don't have a washing machine. You don't have all these basic things that we take for granted in countries like Britain. So women in a society like that, you're very, very oppressive, because you've got to feed all those 5 children. You've got to wash clothes for those 5 children. You've got to bathe them every day. You've got to try and educate them the best you can. You've got to try and help them when they get diseases and get ill. It's a constant cycle. It's very difficult to get out of that poverty situation. And that's why I'm saying that we need to change the way we look at this issue of population. Now, look at the deaths. Mortality rate is horrendous. The mortality rate in countries like Cuba is like 11 deaths per 100,000. This is 789 deaths. It's crazy numbers we're talking here. We're talking huge numbers here, okay? That's a high number, 789 deaths per 100,000 people, right? One of the highest rates in the world. So that's terrible. So not only our women are having 5 children, or just over 5 children on average, a lot of them are going to die. And a lot of them will die even before they're 5 as well. So they're dying at birth, they're dying before they're 5, they're dying, you know, I think it's a very sad situation. And I wouldn't wish it on anybody. Look at this. 45% of girls, this is a study in 2013, 45%, nearly half of all girls are married before they're 18. This is exploitation. This is terrible. And look at the contradiction here. Because of this whole nonsense of bride prices, this is all practices. We need to get rid of this. There's no way in Africa we should be having this in this day and age, where families have an incentive because of poverty. See, this is the consequences of poverty. If your family is in poverty, it's an incentive for you to sell your daughters. It sounds horrendous. If you live in Britain, you can't imagine, why would I sell my daughter? But if you haven't eaten for days, you've seen your children dying, this might be the only chance you've got to try and keep your family going. Get a few cows, feed the rest of the children. Hopefully your daughter will have some sort of life with this man. And I'm not saying it's right, but you can understand the pressure people are under. That's why I don't look at prostitution in the same way. If you're a prostitute in Britain, then I would say, I'm not saying there aren't issues with prostitution in Britain when it comes to drugs and, you know, people are abused and all the rest of it. I understand that. But prostitution in Britain is a totally different moral issue when you've got benefits, you've got social housing, you've got legal protection, you've got so many things women can do other than sell their bodies in a country like Britain. But when you're in countries like Sudan, where you've got very little hope, where your parents are selling you off when you're a child, what is your alternative? So how do you get out of this situation? So this is where it's a very, very difficult situation. That's why poverty is a very, very sad reality. You don't wish poverty on anybody. Got another point here. Yes, people are coerced by poverty. Absolutely. Poverty I think is one of the worst things in the whole, one of the biggest contradictions anywhere on earth. With all the wealth there is in the world, there's no need for people to be living like this. It really frustrates me. And it's one of my biggest desires is to transform this situation in Africa. If I can help create more better leaders in Africa, this is why I do what I do, why I'm so passionate about this. If we can have more and better leaders in Africa that can change this situation, we can have a better life for all of us. Look at this, menstrual cycles. These are all realities. This is a survey that was done where girls said, they fed back and said, look, menstrual cycles, lack of access to sanitary towels prevents them from attending school. These are real issues of poverty that we cannot just push aside and say, oh, it's just a Western perception and, oh, it's just Western, you don't need sanitary towels, you don't. But we, you know, what's the alternative here? What are we saying these women should do and these girls should do? You know, and then you have this violence to go with it. Now we're going to go into the next level. Long distances to go to school, lack of safe sanitation. That means that they're getting abducted, sexual harassment, and they're getting lots of gender-based violence. And the gender-based violence is all basically girls. you know. There's also a disproportionately low number of female teachers as well, less than 10%. It's another barrier because it doesn't encourage girls to go to school when there's very few women in school. Now, if you look at Britain, just as an example, most teachers in Britain, primary school teachers in Britain, are women. So it shows a complete opposite, where more than 90% of the teachers are men. Again, not encouraging girls to go to school. So this is massive, massive problem here. How do you get out of this cycle? And as I said, gender-based violence is very high. And of course, we're talking about males on females. When we say gender violence, we're basically saying violence on women. So this is a big, big problem in Southern Sudan. Okay, you contrast this Rwanda, where we said the safety of Rwandan women is very, very high. One of the safest places in Africa for women to live. You know, virtually zero rape, very low levels of rape, or not public rape anyway. Certainly maybe in people's homes and that, but certainly being raped on the street, abducted and whatever, that doesn't happen. It's not happening in Rwanda. And selling children and all that, when everybody's got access to school free, if you can afford to send all your children to school, they can all go to school, they can all get access to healthcare. There isn't a reason to sell your children and your girls. So these are the kind of protections we need. Right, let's look at government and politics just very briefly. There's only a few bits on this. 5 out of the 29 ministerial positions are held by women. Remember, in Rwanda, it was half. 10 out of the 28 deputy ministers are held by women. So it's progress. It's better, but it's not great. It's not fantastic. It's just a bit better. So out of what? 57 ministers, 15 are women. Nowhere near half. But women were active in the liberation struggle, but even in traditionally very female roles, though. So when we say liberation, look at the in brackets here: providing food and shelter, caring for children, caring for the wounded heroes and heroines. That's a very, very, very traditional women's roles. So not great story really there at all. Let's look at healthcare. Another major problem. So healthcare typically is in what it is in most places in the world. You have primary healthcare, you have health centers, healthcare centers, and you have hospitals. But how many? Very few. You know, it's just really a sad story. Structures in healthcare services delivered through this primary, secondary, and tertiary levels, which is basically what I just said. Look at this. At least 80% of the population live on less than $1 a day. I mean, how do you survive? Remember I said per capita is what? $300 per person. So that's why if it's $300 per person, the average person has only got less than $1 a day to live on. If you compare it to Botswana, if you're on $19,000 a day, how much is that? Let's have a look at that quickly. $19,000 and you divide that by 365. That's the difference between $50 a day and $1 a day. I mean, that's a massive difference, right? If the average wealth is $50 a day, or the average wealth is only $1 a day. So even in a country where things are cheap, $1 is still $1. It's still not going to get you far. Okay? I'm sure you couldn't survive on $1 a day. And remember, this is a country where you're not just living on $1 a day, where you've got healthcare and education, and housing is cheap. You're living in a country where you don't have healthcare, you don't have clean water, you don't have education free, and you're living on $1 a day. So it just compounds everything. I told you already about the high infant mortality rates, are very, very, very high. I told you that already. Let's look at education. Education in South Sudan is basically typical to anywhere in the world. 8 years in primary, 4 years in secondary, 4 years in university level. So, but the problem is there's only one university in the whole country. So out of 11 million people, you got one university. So this is what I'm saying. And if most people don't have access to transport, how do you get to university if you're living miles away from anywhere? You got no money, you got no, school, there's no train, bus services. How do you go to school? How do you go to university? It's just not possible for most people. You've only got one functional teacher training college. There's not enough teachers in the country. One in the whole country, 11 million people. Compare that to what we said about Rwanda, where we had tens of thousands of graduates a year. We had multiple universities. It's a totally different situation, yeah? 8,000 primary schools is great, but 120 secondary schools for 11 million people? So probably half of them are in school. So even if you said half of that again is in primary school, what you got, let's say 5, 6 million, say 2.5 million people. So 2.5 million people, sorry, 2.5 million children divided by 120. So that's 20,000. You need 20,000 children per school. That's not going to work, is it? That's 120,000 children going secondary school. 20,000 children in one secondary school. So clearly, most children aren't going to school. Because even if the secondary school could hold 1,000 people, that's only 120,000. It's nothing. So most people aren't getting education. And look at the literacy rate. The literacy rate for women is 16%. So I say that again. 84% of women cannot read or write. 60% of men cannot read or write. I mean, you can't develop a nation with that level of illiteracy. Very, very difficult. Because again, most people are going to be very basic, be able to do basic work. What they're going to invent? Are they going to invent an iPhone? And are they going to invent technology? It's very, very difficult with that basic level of education where you haven't got basic science. You can't read or write. It's very difficult to run a business if you can't write things down and so on and so on. It's just very, very difficult. So they're trying to do something about it, and they are doing state building, and there's some efforts with national plans to do something about it, but the results so far are not great. Public expenditure is one of the worst, one of the world's lowest for education in the world. Well, if you've got a country that's got very little money, they're not going to be able to spend much on education. It's not, you know, it's just a reality. It doesn't matter how great your governance is. If you haven't got the money, you haven't got the money. They've got this thing called a general education sector plan that was brought in 2017 for 5 years. And the idea was to try and improve safety, resilience, and social cohesion, and try and contain the stress on the system where there's just more children than there are places to go. But as I said, it's been very, very difficult. This is what they tried to do in the first 2 years, building more infrastructure, supply more basic teaching. But we've said already, there's teaching and learning materials, but there's so little teachers. Regularizing teacher salaries are a problem, so teachers are not getting paid. There's very little money to get to teachers, so there's no incentive to be a teacher. And the increased enrollment where there's just nowhere to put them. So that was me kind of finishing off, really. And I just wanted to show a few pictures of it. There's very little pictures. That's the peace agreement there. You can see John Duran in the background there. And there was a Guardian article that showed modern Sudan. As you see, beautiful skin people. But, you know, it's not a great story.